EV road trips. Some people say this is not the best use of an electric vehicle. Others say no problem. Well, I took a 1 month long 8,000 mile road trip in my Tesla Model 3, and here's my experience. This is my car. It's a 2019 Tesla Model 3 long range. New, it had a 315 mile rated range. Now that it's a few years old, a full charge typically goes to 292 miles. I also have the full self-driving package, which expands the driver assist features of the Autopilot system. For any road trip, it's important to have lots of storage for all your stuff. The Tesla Model 3 has a good-sized trunk. It has a sub-trunk, as you can see, with the removable panel. And there's also the front trunk, or frunk. This was plenty of space for 3 people. The way we organized it was to put the stuff in the frunk that we didn't think we would need, but might, like jackets and sweaters for Yellowstone in case it got cold, and put the stuff that we were done with, like souvenirs, in the sub-trunk. So this is our route. We started at our home in Massachusetts, drove west, mostly across I-90, hitting a number of interesting stops, in particular Yellowstone, my family in Boise, Idaho, and then we eventually cut south from Bend, Oregon, down to Disneyland, and then back across to the east, mostly on I-70. Most of this route was on interstates. However, some of it was well off the beaten path, and I'll talk about some of those spots in particular later on. No presentation about driving in a Tesla would be complete without talking about Autopilot. We had an interesting situation the first night. We were driving on the New York Thruway near Syracuse, and all of a sudden the car slammed on the brakes for no apparent reason. Then I saw the deer in front of me. I had no time to react, but the car had a full half second to second of braking before the deer got past us. There's absolutely no way I could have avoided hitting that deer had I been driving myself instead of having the car on autopilot. This saved our trip on the very first night. I did almost all the driving on autopilot. This is near perfect on the highways, at least on the major highways. On some of the smaller roads, there was some phantom braking, especially on the smaller highways when the sun is low. I don't know if that was because of shadows or glare in the cameras. It was a bit annoying, but it was never unsafe. However, at Yellowstone, being able to look around as the driver, it was priceless. You have to pay attention to avoid things that autopilot won't take care of, like obstacles in the road and some sharp turns. Sometimes goes a little fast, but once you know what to watch out for, it really takes the stress off the driving, and it's just so much better. I couldn't imagine doing this much driving and being comfortable without autopilot. Everyone asks about the range on an electric car. The rated range is really the optimal mileage you can get if you're doing maybe 60 miles an hour and it's flat in good weather. This is significantly impacted by your speed, also mountains, and just a bit by air conditioning and the weather. We didn't have any huge headwinds, though that's kind of like going uphill. You can see in the consumption graph, that was when we at first were going up a mountain and then back down. Found it kind of amusing that the car said it could go 1,000 miles at the rate we were going, which was all downhill for mile after mile. Generally, when you start going 75 or 80, you'll be 15 to 20% above rated range. I didn't keep careful statistics. If you're going too fast to reach your destination, the car will tell you to slow down, and we never had to worry about that because there were plenty of charging stops. So speaking of charging, One of the things with the Tesla superchargers is they're not all the same speed. Many of the older ones are 110 or 150 kilowatt. The newer ones are 250 kilowatt, and they are much faster. So we learned to always try to route to one when we had a choice. However, what we also found is pretty much always the car was charged and ready to go before we were ready, because we were, using the restroom, eating something, maybe doing a little shopping, looking around. Also, we would only usually charge to about 80% because the last 20% takes a lot longer. The exception would be if we were going off the interstate for a while, then we'd want to charge up all the way. Speaking of going off the interstates, when doing that, I had to plan ahead of time, checking on where the chargers were, exactly how far we were going, would we run into any trouble. So all of that I planned ahead before leaving. The biggest ball of twine in Minnesota. Yes, it's not just a Weird Al song, it's a real tourist trap, and we decided we wanted to see it. And it's way off the interstate. It was 248 miles between superchargers, which we could do, though it is pushing it, especially if we were running the air conditioner a lot and wanted to go fairly fast, though it was smaller highways, so that often was not what we would do. So when planning, I checked the PlugShare website, which is a site and an app that lists most of the available EV charging options, and it turns out that across the street from the hotel that I had booked, there was some sort of electrical contractor place, and they had a free level 2 charger, which means it's a 240 volt charger, similar to what I charge at in my garage at home. So I plugged in when we got there, left the car overnight, and in the morning we had a completely full charge and didn't even have to stop at the next supercharger. If you've ever been to Yellowstone, you know that that's not on the interstate. When I was planning, it looked like we could only really do the north entrance or the west entrance. The south might work, but looked a little challenging, and it was completely not on the way that we were going. I would have loved to have come in on the northeast entrance through the Beartooth Highway. I hear it's really scenic, but there just wasn't any charging option. So we planned on the north entrance. However, because of the floods, that was closed. So we detoured to the west entrance, charged at the West Yellowstone Supercharger, and then drove in to the Old Faithful Lodge where we were staying. There is a level 2 charger for 2 cars at the Old Faithful Lodge, and I was hoping to be able to use it, and I was lucky. It was not full on either night that we were there, so we were able to charge, do the full Grand Loop Road, and leave without having to stop immediately with a nearly empty battery at West Yellowstone. It turns out I would have been fine charging at West Yellowstone on the way out as well, because even though it's a lot of miles, you can only go 45 miles per hour in Yellowstone, so the battery doesn't drop that quickly. There is a lot of up and down, but you get back probably 80% of the extra power you use going up on your way back down. So that ended up working fairly well. It would be nice if they would add a supercharger somewhere on the Grand Loop, and hopefully in the future we'll see that. Craters of the Moon was another significant off-interstate leg of the trip. The car actually said it was too far to reach the next supercharger in the navigation, but the car was being conservative, and I knew that by miles we should be able to make it. I drove a little slow on our way to the motel at Arco because speed, as I said before, makes a big difference. We considered charging with an extension cord from the wall outlet in our motel room, This would have given me about 4 miles of range per hour of charging. Actually, if I had the right adapter, I could have plugged into the 240 volt outlet that the air conditioner was plugged into. However, doing either of those would have required leaving the door to our room propped open slightly for the cord while we were sleeping, and that wasn't really a good idea. So we didn't do that. I had found a couple of RV parks that had the 1450 plugs, which is the 240 volt plug that the car's mobile charger can use as a backup plan, though we ended up not needing any of that, and we made it to Twin Falls and charged there. After visiting my family in Boise, the next major destination was Disneyland. Normally, the route we would take would be to cut through eastern Oregon and go down to Nevada in Winnemucca. However, that's just too far. There was a campground I found where we could plug in to an RV outlet. It would probably take about an hour or two before we had enough charge to make it to Winnemucca, and it looked like there were some interesting hikes, so I considered doing that. My son actually wanted to stop in Bend, Oregon and see the last Blockbuster, so we ended up doing that, and we also added Crater Lake to the trip. Really, going north-south in Nevada just isn't a good option in an EV right now. North-south in Nevada is smaller 2-lane highways, and they need to add some more charging stations before that's really practical. Hopefully in the next year or two that problem will be solved. This was really the only major route change that we made because we were in an electric car. The world's largest twine ball in Kansas. Yup, Minnesota doesn't have the only one, and we wanted more. This was again not on the interstate, so we had to detour a bit. Had we not been in an electric car, we would have taken a slightly different route that would have been more direct, but it would have been also more on the small local highways, which are slower, so I don't know that it actually added that much time to the trip, though it was a bit of a route change because of the electric car. But it all worked well. So how much did all of this supercharging cost? Well, the single most expensive stop was just under $30. I think it was in Denver, Colorado, but Tesla doesn't report the location on the credit card charges, so it's hard to be sure. There were 48 total supercharging stops with a total cost of $718.66. That works out to about 9 cents a mile. And if we assume gas was $4 a gallon, which is a little low for this trip, that would be the equivalent of cost of a 45 mile per gallon car. We also did charge for free at 5 locations, such as staying with family, where we charged from a wall outlet in a couple of places, though we were still able to get a full charge because we were there for more than one day charging. So accounting for the fact that we did get some free charging as well, perhaps it was the equivalent of 10 cents a mile. Still, that's not bad. So what lessons did I learn? Well, first of all, hotels with charging are rare. The only place we stayed that had EV charging was the Old Faithful Lodge. I had expected when I started planning this that it would be fairly common and we'd be able to charge, every 2 or 3 nights, but that's not the case. Someday it will be standard, but not now. As I mentioned before in the charging, we always wanted to route to the 250 kilowatt chargers whenever possible. This made a much bigger difference than I had been expecting. We only had one case where we had to wait to charge, and that was in Southern Oregon. I was a little surprised we didn't have that more often. The California superchargers are huge and always had space. We do want to avoid superchargers at hotels whenever possible. Usually these are smaller and older stations, and they're really boring. But we did find a number of chargers that were near thrift stores, which my son loved. Lots of good Goodwill memories. Final thoughts? Taking this road trip in an EV was great. Autopilot in particular made the trip so much better. I wouldn't want to do this in a non-Tesla right now because the supercharging network really made it possible. But once Tesla opens up the supercharging network to other cars, or when the other charging networks finish building out, it'll be fine. Really, this was a better trip than it would have been in any other car.